Today we're going to talk about active learning. This is a term you might have heard before, but this begs the question, what is all this talk about active learning? Why are we talking about it? Well, to start, let's talk about what it is. What is active learning? And so when we refer to active learning, we're talking about a teaching approach or approach to instruction in which students are engaged with the material they're learning, either through reading, writing, talking, active listening, and reflecting. And this is a way to engage and think about and practice higher order thinking skills. Now, this stands in contrast to other types of instruction, like a lecture-based course in which teachers do the majority of the talking and the students are there as passive listeners as opposed to active ones. Now, there's been a lot of studies on the benefits of active learning, and this particular meta-study in 2014 looked at hundreds of different research studies that found that students in active learning classes are more likely to succeed than those in traditional lecture-based courses, whereas those are more likely to fail. One of the features of active learning is it places the student at the center, as opposed to putting the teacher at the center in a more traditional lecture-based course. Now, here's kind of a little joke where he's teaching Spot, the dog, to whistle, but Spot's not actually whistling because just because he said he taught him doesn't necessarily mean he learned it. So if we're just speaking at a bunch of students, maybe we're teaching them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're learning. In a student-centered classroom, they're more likely to be really learning and absorbing the material because they're getting a chance to practice with it and work and struggle. Now, not all active learning is the same. So when you're designing an activity for your class, you want to ask yourself, is your activity active for active sake, or is it actually helping the students learn? So here's a common scenario that might happen in your class. After attending a teaching conference on the importance of active learning, a TA of an interbio course designs a play to illustrate the movement of electrons through the electron transport system. The TA prints out descriptions for the actors who follow those instructions to play their part in the activity. So, yes, this is active. The students are moving around. But is this more student-centered or is this more teacher-centered? Well, to me, this seems like a very teacher-centered activity, right? She's doing all of the thinking. She's creating the descriptions, or she's creating the play, and the students are really just being passive players. One way to make this a little better and make this more as a genuine active learning activity that's learner-centered is to have the students create the play or the descriptions for the different actors within the electron transport system and have them act it out. So that gives them a chance to think through and really think about how these players integrate and work together. Active learning comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. It can look different in different courses. Now, these are some things you may have already tried in your classroom. Something like polling, Socratic questioning or open questions, class discussions, problem solving and having the students problem solve, reflective writing, review games, and of course, peer instruction. Now, peer instruction is a really effective form of active learning that we're going to talk a little bit more about. Now, I'm going to show you a video from Dr. Mazur at Harvard, and he's a physics professor, and he's going to talk about a time where he accidentally stumbled upon the power of peer instruction.
To this question about the truck and the heavy car, I took 2 minutes to explain it. I made a drawing of the truck, a drawing of the car, I drew the forces, and I said, by Newton's third law, these two forces are equal. What's more to explain about it? And I'd done that with my back to them on the board, and I turned around, and I could see at once from their faces that they were confused. So I said, is there a question? They were so confused, they could not articulate a question. So I thought, this is serious. So I erased the board, I started all over again, and I thought, maybe I should bring in Newton's second law and talk about acceleration. So in the next 8 minutes, I managed to produce the most, in my opinion, brilliant explanation you could think of. And after 8 minutes, the whole board was covered with equations and drawings. I turned around. They looked even more confused. And they could still not articulate the question. When I said, is there a question? They were they could not articulate what it was that confused them. I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing. I knew that half of them had given the right answer. So in a moment of despair, I said to them, why don't you just discuss it with each other? I had 250 students in the class. And something happened that I'd never seen before. All 250 students started talking. It was complete chaos. They forgot about me in front of the class. I could have walked away. They would not have noticed. But what is really interesting was that in just 2 minutes, they figured it out. I'd taken 10 minutes, 2 + 8, to explain it unsuccessfully, and they in 2 minutes explained to each other. I first thought, how can it be? But imagine you have 2 students sitting next to each other, John and Mary. Mary has the right answer because she understands it. John does not. On average, Mary is more likely to convince John than the other way around, simply by the force of logic. But here's the important point. Mary is more likely to explain it to John than Professor Mazur in front of the class. Why? Because she has only recently learned it. She still knows what the difficulties are that a beginning learner has. Whereas Professor Mazur, in front of the class, has learned it such a long time ago. To him it is so obvious, so simple, that he no longer understands why somebody doesn't understand it. It's what my colleague Steven Pinker in the psychology department calls the curse of knowledge.
So you just heard Dr. Mazur talk about the power of having students talk to one another because they recently learned the material and are able to connect with each other and understand what steps are needed in order to get a certain topic. Now, this brings us into the idea of collaborative learning, often called group work. And so it's a type of peer instruction that really does enhance student learning. And while it's not exactly the same as active learning, it definitely falls within the umbrella. And so one of the great things about group work is it allows students to interact with multiple peers and get lots of different perspectives as they try to work to solve a problem or to create a discussion or something along those lines. Now, one of the things that you want to really think about in group work, and something that we'll explore more in class, is the fact that structure and adding structure can mitigate some of the challenges that may come up with group work. I know a lot of people say, oh, maybe groups don't work well together. Maybe, one student is doing all of the work, whereas the other students are kind of coasting by. Well, if you add structure into things, you can certainly make it a little bit easier to facilitate and keep those things from happening. Now, of course, there are also equity issues and concerns that you need to think about in group work. Thinking about how you create the groups and allowing students to really mix students together in a way that somebody doesn't feel left out. And making sure that you create classroom norms in order to make students feel welcome and able to share with their fellow students. Creating community helps there too. Online and in a remote environment, breakout rooms or creating study groups or outside projects can really help foster this group work. So it's not something that you can't do online. You can do this both in person and in your remote teaching class. And there have been also a lot of studies, and cognitive psychologists and education researchers that have performed hundreds of studies supporting this increased and deeper learning that's associated with interacting with peers during the learning process. So this is something really powerful that we encourage you to do with your students, to have them talk with each other, work with each other, whether in pairs or in groups, as a way to really enhance their learning of the subject material. So now that you've learned a little bit about active learning, what other active learning strategies are there? Maybe you've already tried some. Look at the list of active learning strategies we provided on CCLE. And on the discussion board, share some strategies that have worked in your discipline face-to-face. Maybe ones that you've experienced or ones that you've used in your own class before. How have you tried to transition these activities for remote teaching, if you have? If not, what are some equity concerns that you might imagine students might have when trying to do active or collaborative learning, especially in a remote environment? So these are some questions we'd like you to think of before our class starts. We'll see you then.